Most people know America's story in Vietnam. Fewer know Australia's. For 10 years, Australian soldiers fought in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy province. Outnumbered, undersupplied, and largely forgotten by the rest of the world. They were not fighting America's war. They were fighting their own. Australia sent some of its finest soldiers to Vietnam. The 6th Battalion, the SASR, special forces so effective that the Viet Cong put a price on their heads. Regular infantrymen who held the line when nobody else could. They fought in monsoon rains and 40-degree heat. They were ambushed on jungle tracks with no names. They watched their mates die in rice paddies 10,000 miles from home. And when they came back, Australia didn't want to hear about it either. If you're new here, this channel exists to tell the stories history forgot. Hit subscribe and leave a like before we begin. It takes 2 seconds and it keeps these stories alive. This is Australia's Vietnam War, and it deserves to be remembered. The jungle doesn't forgive mistakes. In early 1970, deep in the treacherous terrain of Phuoc Tuy province, South Vietnam, a unit of Australian soldiers marched into the unknown. Their mission: root out a hidden enemy entrenched in the infamous Long Hai Hills, a labyrinth of caves, tunnels, and landmines, controlled by one of the most elusive Viet Cong battalions in the war. What they faced was far more than guerrilla warfare. It was a brutal test of survival in terrain designed to kill. This was Operation Hammersley, a high-stakes campaign led by the 7th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, supported by tanks, artillery, and armored vehicles. But even firepower meant little when the enemy was buried underground, and the hills themselves were laced with death. Australia's role in the Vietnam War is often overshadowed by larger American operations. But this battle tells a story of courage, endurance, and jungle warfare at its most intense. It was a clash fought not just with bullets, but against heat, exhaustion, and the ever-present fear of the unseen. This is the untold battle for the Long Hai Hills. This is Operation Hammersley. By 1970, the Vietnam War had become a grinding, relentless conflict. Guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and booby traps defined the battlefield. For the Australian forces stationed in Phuoc Tuy province, the enemy wasn't just hard to find. They were buried deep in the landscape, emerging only to strike and vanish without a trace. Australia's presence in Vietnam had steadily increased since 1962, but it wasn't until 1966 that they took full control of operations in Phuoc Tuy. Their responsibility was to pacify the province, a task made infinitely harder by the presence of the D445 Viet Cong Battalion. D445 wasn't a typical guerrilla unit. These fighters knew the terrain intimately. They built entire underground networks, bunkers, supply caches, command centers, hidden within the Long Hai Hills, a strategic high ground near the coast. This area had become a notorious Viet Cong stronghold, used to launch attacks, store weapons, and disrupt Australian patrols. Mines, sniper attacks, and sudden ambushes were routine in this region. Repeated Australian attempts to clear the hills had only temporary success. The enemy always returned. Worse, the hills were laced with booby traps and anti-personnel mines, some handmade, others Soviet or Chinese supplied. Every step was a gamble. By late 1969, intelligence revealed that D445 had once again reinforced the Long Hai Hills. Their presence threatened Australian fire bases, patrol routes, and local villages. Commanders knew that unless the hills were cleared once and for all, the Viet Cong would continue to dominate the region. And so, a bold operation was conceived, one that would push into the enemy's territory, destroy their bases, and cripple their operations in the south. It would require infantry, armored vehicles, artillery, air support, engineers, and nerves of steel. This would be Operation Hammersley, a name that would soon become synonymous with courage under fire. Operation Hammersley officially began on February 10, 1970, but its roots stretched back weeks prior. Australian intelligence confirmed that elements of the D445 Viet Cong Battalion had returned to the Long Hai Hills. Their presence wasn't just symbolic. It was a direct threat to local pacification efforts and Australian fire bases in the region. The plan was simple in theory, but dangerous in execution. Sweep through the hills, locate and destroy enemy bunkers, supply caches, tunnel complexes, and landmine stockpiles. The operation would also aim to sever the Viet Cong's access to nearby villages and coastal resupply routes. In short, it was a deep strike into the heart of enemy-held terrain. The main assault force would be the 7th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 7RAR, a combat-proven unit known for its discipline and resilience. They would be supported by elements from the 1st Armored Regiment, wielding Centurion tanks, and M113 armored personnel carriers from the 3rd Cavalry Regiment. Artillery support came from the 1st Field Regiment, ready to deliver heavy firepower when needed. Engineers from the 1st Field Squadron would be essential for clearing mines and demolishing bunkers. In coordination with American and South Vietnamese forces, the Australians prepared for a prolonged campaign. Supply lines were established, medevac protocols reviewed, and intelligence officers pored over aerial reconnaissance to identify likely enemy positions. This wasn't going to be a quick in-and-out raid. The terrain alone made movement slow and dangerous. The Viet Cong had home field advantage. Hidden bunkers, traps, and sniper nests everywhere. But Australian commanders knew this operation had to succeed. The long high hills could no longer be a safe haven for the enemy. The time had come to face the jungle and whatever was waiting inside it. The opening days of Operation Hammersley were a brutal introduction to the kind of war the Australians would face in the long high hills. On February 10th, 7RAR began its advance, moving cautiously into the area just west of the hills. Almost immediately, the jungle reminded them that nothing came easy here. The dense foliage, limited visibility, and the heat was suffocating. Every step was measured. Every tree could hide a sniper, and every patch of ground might be wired to kill. It didn't take long for the first contact. A forward patrol triggered a Claymore-style booby trap, wounding 2 soldiers. Moments later, the unit came under small arms fire from concealed VC positions. The Australians responded with disciplined return fire and quickly called in artillery support, forcing the attackers to withdraw. It was a textbook response, but it showed just how quickly things could go wrong. Throughout the week, 7RAR patrolled deeper into the area. They began uncovering a network of abandoned bunkers and destroyed supply caches. Some positions had been recently used, still stocked with ammunition and food. Others were eerily empty, the Viet Cong having vanished just before the Australians arrived. The threat of mines and improvised explosive devices was constant. Soldiers walked in single file, eyes scanning the ground, ears tuned to the unnatural. The engineers worked tirelessly ahead of patrols, using mine detectors and bare hands to disarm deadly traps. One M113 armored vehicle hit a mine concealed beneath foliage, blowing off its front left track and wounding its crew. The vehicle was later recovered, but it underscored the danger faced even by armored units. Despite the challenges, the Australians were making progress. Dozens of bunkers were located and destroyed. Hidden ammunition dumps were detonated. Maps were updated with new tunnel locations. Still, they hadn't yet drawn out the full strength of D445. The Viet Cong were holding back, watching, and waiting for the right moment to strike. The Australians knew it was coming. They could feel it in the jungle, that thick silence before the storm. Before we move into the full-scale combat that would define Operation Hammersley, ask yourself, had you ever heard this story before today? If this kind of detail, tension, and forgotten history speaks to you, give the video a like. It might seem small, but it helps us reach others who want to uncover the real battles behind the headlines. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing. We cover stories just like this, raw, untold, and real. Now let's step into the heart of the long high hills, where the real fight was just beginning. The turning point of Operation Hammersley came in the final days of February. After more than a week of skirmishes, booby traps, and cautious patrols, Australian forces began pushing deeper into the heart of the long high hills. Intelligence suggested the presence of a major Viet Cong base hidden within a dense section of jungle, fortified with tunnels and camouflage bunkers. This was no longer a routine sweep. It was a hunt for the enemy's core stronghold. On February 22nd, a company from 7RAR moved to investigate a suspected bunker system. As they approached the site, the lead elements came under sudden, concentrated small arms and machine gun fire. The Viet Cong had sprung their trap. The Australians hit the dirt, returning fire as the jungle exploded with noise. The enemy was well entrenched, using elevated firing positions and pre-sighted fields of fire. It was a carefully prepared ambush. Within minutes, radio calls requested support. Artillery batteries from the 1st Field Regiment zeroed in, pounding the hillside with high explosives. Centurion tanks and M113s were brought forward, their armor shrugging off small arms fire as they rumbled into the kill zone. The Centurions opened fire with their 20-pounder main guns and coaxial machine guns, tearing through the jungle and bunker walls. Air support arrived overhead, dropping ordnance on suspected fallback positions. The ground shook, and the jungle lit up in bursts of fire and smoke. The fighting raged for hours. Despite their fortified position, the Viet Cong began to break. Some tried to flee through escape tunnels. Others stayed behind, determined to delay the Australians as long as possible. By nightfall, the area was secured, but it came at a cost. Several Australians were wounded, and one was killed during the assault. As engineers moved in, they uncovered what the VC had tried to hide: an extensive tunnel complex with command bunkers, sleeping quarters, medical stations, and large weapons caches. Some tunnels were booby-trapped. Others had been hastily abandoned. It was clear the Australians had stumbled onto a major operational center of the D445 Battalion. Over the next several days, additional combat broke out as patrols uncovered more outposts and small VC rearguards. These weren't mass engagements, but sharp, violent encounters. The enemy would strike quickly and fade away, leaving behind traps and casualties. But the psychological momentum had shifted. The Viet Cong had lost one of their most important strongholds, and for the first time in months, Australian forces had gained a firm foothold in the Longhai Hills. Operation Hammersley was no longer a search mission. It had become a direct assault, and Australia was winning. After the intense combat of late February, it became clear that the Viet Cong were no longer fighting to hold ground. They were fighting to escape. Scouts reported signs of hurried withdrawals, blood trails leading into dense vegetation, half-buried caches, and abandoned packs filled with documents, maps, and personal effects. What had once been a well-organized VC-based system was unraveling. The D445 Battalion, battered and outmaneuvered, was melting back into the jungle. But retreat didn't mean safety for the Australians. If anything, the enemy's retreat signaled a different kind of danger: desperation. In the following days, Australian patrols continued their sweeps, but with heightened caution. The terrain was now mined more heavily than before. Claymores, tripwires, and pressure plates were buried across likely approach routes. One misstep could undo an entire operation. Engineers led the way, crawling, probing, detecting. They worked in silence, often under cover of riflemen scanning for snipers. One misjudged step could be fatal, and in several tragic cases it was. As 7 RAR moved through the last remaining pockets of resistance, they discovered more tunnel networks. Most of them collapsed or rigged to explode. The Viet Cong had either destroyed them or set traps to punish anyone who dared follow. Some tunnels extended deep into the hills, wide enough for a man to crawl through with equipment. These were not just hiding spots. They were full-fledged operating bases, built over years of hidden labor. Despite the danger, Australians persisted. Day after day, they destroyed bunker systems, burned supply dumps, and rendered tunnels unusable with explosive charges. A few short engagements broke out with rearguard VC fighters, but these were quickly suppressed. By early March, the Longhai Hills were no longer a stronghold. They were a scarred battlefield, silent and emptied. The D445 Battalion, though not annihilated, had been severely disrupted. Their command network was shattered, their weapons caches destroyed, and their ability to launch coordinated attacks in the region was crippled. Operation Hammersley was nearing its end. The hills that had once been a Viet Cong fortress were now under Australian control, at least for now. But every soldier knew, in Vietnam, the jungle never stayed quiet for long. By the time Operation Hammersley concluded on March 9, 1970, it was clear the Australians had achieved a hard-won victory. The mission had lasted nearly a full month, and in that time, 7th RAR and supporting units had cleared large portions of the Longhai Hills, destroyed extensive Viet Cong infrastructure, and struck a decisive blow against the D445 Battalion. Over 90 bunker systems were located and destroyed. Miles of tunnel networks were mapped, collapsed, or demolished. Large weapons caches were seized, including mortars, mines, AK-47 rifles, ammunition stockpiles, and food reserves. Intelligence documents captured during the sweep revealed enemy plans, command structures, and safe house locations throughout Phuoc Tuy province. Most importantly, the Viet Cong had been forced to abandon one of their most valuable strategic positions. Their ability to stage attacks from the long high hills, once a major threat to both Australian forces and local civilians, was effectively neutralized. But the operation came at a cost. 9 Australian soldiers lost their lives, and dozens more were wounded. Many of the casualties came from mines and booby traps, rather than direct combat. It was a stark reminder of the kind of war being fought in Vietnam. A war where danger didn't just come from bullets, but from the ground itself. For the D445 Battalion, the losses were significant, though exact numbers remain unknown. What is clear is that they were no longer capable of mounting serious operations in the area for some time. Hammersley was considered a tactical and operational success, and it reinforced the importance of coordinated, multi-branch operations involving infantry, armor, engineers, artillery, and air support. It also validated Australian doctrine focused on patrolling, ambush disruption, and jungle warfare, tactics that would be carried into future operations. Operation Hammersley may not be as well known as battles like Long Tan or Coral Balmoral, but for those who fought there, it left a lasting mark, both physically and mentally. The operation showcased the Australian Army's adaptability in one of the most unforgiving environments of the Vietnam War. In the dense jungle and treacherous hills, Australian troops demonstrated discipline, precision, and cohesion. It was a textbook example of how combined arms warfare, infantry working hand in hand with armor, artillery, engineers, and air support, could overcome even the most entrenched guerrilla forces. It also highlighted the hidden dangers of jungle warfare. While traditional battles involved lines and fronts, the war in Phuoc Tuy was different. Mines, traps, snipers, tunnels. The enemy was invisible until the moment they struck. Hammersley proved that the true battle wasn't just against men with guns, but against an environment designed to kill. In the years that followed, the lessons learned from Hammersley would influence Australian military doctrine, especially in areas of mine detection, tunnel clearance, and jungle movement tactics. The psychological and physical demands of such operations reshaped how Australia trained its soldiers for combat in similar conditions. And though the D445 Battalion would eventually regroup and fight again, their setback in the long high hills stood as proof that Australia's soldiers could, and would, take the fight to the enemy's doorstep, no matter how dangerous it might be. Operation Hammersley wasn't about territory. It was about denying the enemy sanctuary and proving that even in the most hostile terrain, discipline and determination could win the day. For the men of 7 RAR and their supporting units, this wasn't just another mission. It was a deadly game of patience, nerves, and grit. Every hill cleared, every tunnel destroyed, was paid for in sweat, blood, and silent courage. Though their names rarely make the headlines, the soldiers who fought in Phuoc Tuy left a legacy, one carved into the jungle and into military history. If you want to hear more of these untold stories, the kind that don't make it into textbooks, consider subscribing to the channel. There are many more battles like Hammersley, buried in silence, waiting to be uncovered. This was a fight against the hidden enemy. This was Operation Hammersley. The jungle didn't move. Not a bird, not a breeze. Just heat, sweat, and silence. Lying still under layers of camouflage netting, 6 Australian soldiers watched a column of enemy troops walk past, just 10 meters away. 50 Viet Cong fighters, armed, alert, and unaware they were being watched. The Australians didn't move a muscle. No cough, no whisper, not even a breath too loud. Because these weren't regular soldiers. They were ghosts, members of Australia's Special Air Service Regiment, elite reconnaissance units trained to operate deep in enemy territory, to observe, to ambush, to vanish. In Vietnam, they became the shadow warriors. No unit from Australia fought in more dangerous conditions, with fewer men, or in such absolute silence. Their missions were secret, their movements classified. Most of what they did never made the headlines. But the enemy knew. The Viet Cong feared them, because by the time you heard them, it was already too late. From 1966 to 1971, the SASR patrolled the deadliest jungles of Viet Cong province. No backup, no fanfare, no glory. Just six-man patrols moving like ghosts, calling in airstrikes, setting claymore traps, and disrupting entire VC operations. One silent kill at a time. This is not the story of battles with helicopters and tanks. This is the story of men who operated where no one else dared, the ones who hunted in the shadows, and made it back to tell the tale. If you believe the hidden war deserves to be remembered, hit that like button and consider subscribing. These are the stories most people never hear, but they should. Let's uncover the untold war of Australia's ghost warriors in Vietnam. The Special Air Service Regiment, or SASR, wasn't just another combat unit. These were men trained to survive alone in hostile territory, gather intelligence, and strike without warning. Their motto said it all: who dares wins. Formed in 1957, modeled after Britain's original SAS, the Australian regiment took elite warfare to a new level. They trained in everything from airborne insertion and jungle survival to sabotage, ambush, and long-range reconnaissance. By the time Australia committed troops to Vietnam, the SASR was already built for the kind of war no one wanted to fight, one with no front lines, no rules, and no second chances. In 1966, the first SASR squadron deployed to Vietnam. They weren't sent to hold ground or take territory. They weren't meant to be seen at all. Their job was to move deep into the jungle, often 10 to 15 kilometers beyond friendly lines, and watch. Observe enemy supply routes, track movements, locate camps, report back, and when the time was right, strike fast, hard, and disappear. They operated in Phuoc Tuy province under the command of the 1st Australian Task Force, 1 ATF, but their missions often took them far beyond, into areas swarming with Viet Cong, North Vietnamese Army, and deadly booby traps. While regular infantry fought in platoons or companies, SASR patrols were just 4 to 6 men. That meant stealth wasn't just an option, it was survival. What made them invaluable was their ability to gather real-time intelligence that saved lives. Many large-scale Australian operations, like Bribie, Coburg, and Coral Balmoral, relied on SAS patrols to scout enemy positions days beforehand. They worked closely with American Special Forces, especially the MACV SOG teams, often sharing tactics, gear, and missions. But unlike the Americans, the Australians rarely got public attention. Their success was measured in silence. Missions completed, enemies avoided, traps found before they were triggered. The SASR didn't go to Vietnam for glory. They went because they were the best at what they did, and because someone had to go where no one else could. To survive in the jungles of Vietnam as a 4 to 6 man patrol, every move had to be calculated, every breath measured, every step silent. The SASR weren't built to fight toe-to-toe with large enemy forces. They were designed to stalk, observe, and strike only when the advantage was absolute. Their primary weapons weren't rifles or grenades. It was information. They were the eyes and ears of the battlefield, the ones who saw what no one else could. Stealth first, always movement was slow, deliberate, sometimes just 500 meters per hour. Boots were modified for quieter steps. Camouflage was customized for the terrain. Even their sweat was managed, because the smell could give away their position to enemy scouts. Patrol formations were tight and disciplined. They spoke in hand signals. Radios were used only when absolutely necessary. At night, they set listening posts and hideouts so well camouflaged that even friendly units could walk past without noticing them. SASR soldiers trained to lie still for up to 12 hours without moving, concealed under jungle debris, waiting for enemy movement. If they were compromised, extraction wasn't always guaranteed. They had to fight or vanish. Deadly ambush artists. When they did choose to strike, it was precise and brutal. They set claymore mines along trails used by VC patrols. These directional mines would rip through a group of enemies before they even realized anyone was watching. Ambushes were short and devastating, often less than 30 seconds. After the kill, the SAS team would immediately break contact, calling in artillery or airstrikes to cover their retreat. They never lingered. They didn't loot. They left no trail. Tools of the trade. Each soldier carried as little as possible, but everything had a purpose. Weapons, M16 rifles, CAR-15 carbines, SLRS, M60 light machine guns. Special gear, suppressed pistols, claymores, smoke grenades, signal mirrors. Navigation, compass, maps, protractors. GPS didn't exist. Radios, PRC-25s to communicate with aircraft or HQ, always with strict radio discipline. Their packs were minimal. Rations were designed for extended patrols. Water discipline was critical. Each member knew basic medical treatment, demolition, navigation, and fire support coordination. There were no passengers in an SAS patrol, only specialists, airborne insertion and extraction. Most missions began with a silent insertion by helicopter, usually UH-1 Iroquois Hueys. Sometimes they were dropped by rope into remote jungle clearings or onto ridge lines miles from the nearest base. Extraction was even riskier. If compromised, the patrol would call for urgent pickup, often while under fire. Pilots had just seconds to hover, load, and lift off. More than once, the SASR fought to the skids of the chopper. They weren't out there to win hearts and minds. They weren't out there to take ground. They were there to hunt shadows, gather intelligence, and eliminate threats before anyone else even knew they were there. They were Australia's ghost warriors, and this is how they fought. From 1966 to 1971, the Australian SASR operated in some of the most dangerous terrain in the Vietnam War, and they did it almost entirely unseen. Their main area of operations was Phuoc Tuy Province, the same region where the first Australian task force was based at Nui Dat. But the SAS weren't tied to fixed positions or perimeters. Their job was to go far beyond the wire, deep into enemy territory, where conventional units rarely dared to venture. And they did it with only 4 to 6 men at a time. The province was a nightmare of dense jungle, bamboo thickets, and winding tracks used by Viet Cong guerrillas and North Vietnamese regulars. SAS teams were inserted into these zones to identify enemy routes, camps, and weapon caches without ever being seen. They focused especially on VC supply lines, watching them for days before striking or calling in fire missions. One area, known as the Long Green, became legendary among SAS patrols. Its maze of trails and natural concealment made it a hub for enemy movement and the perfect hunting ground for Australia's elite. Another hot spot was the Long High Hills, a rugged terrain filled with caves and hidden bunkers. It was also the operating base of D445 VC Battalion, one of the most dangerous enemy units in the region. The Long Highs were known for their brutal terrain, frequent ambushes, and a terrifying amount of booby traps, hence the nickname, the Mine Factory. SAS teams were often sent in to observe enemy activity there ahead of major Australian operations. They mapped trails, estimated troop numbers, and sometimes guided artillery fire or airstrikes from the shadows. While the terrain changed, their core missions remained focused and brutal. Reconnaissance and surveillance. Primary task, observe and report. Days spent in OPS, observation posts, watching VC patrols, supply movements, or base locations. Intelligence gathered was used to plan future conventional assaults. Ambushes, fast, violent engagements set up along known enemy trails. Claymore mines and overlapping fire zones allowed a 4-man team to destroy a larger VC patrol in seconds. Immediately followed by withdrawal and possible air support. Target designation and fire coordination. SS patrols could call in artillery and airstrikes with extreme accuracy. They often acted as spotters for air assets, guiding bombs or rockets onto hidden enemy positions. Tracking. Some patrols followed VC footsteps for hours or even days, using broken brush, footprints, or discarded equipment to stay on their trail and set up an ambush. Beyond the wire, beyond the rules. Though they were Australian-led, SAS patrols sometimes worked with American MACV SOG units, especially in reconnaissance missions near the Cambodian border. These missions were highly classified, and occasionally crossed into neutral territory. Officially, Australians weren't supposed to operate outside their assigned province. But in Vietnam, the lines on the map didn't always matter. The SASR weren't just operating behind enemy lines. They were operating beyond what most soldiers even thought possible. And with each mission, they got better, faster, more lethal, more invisible. They didn't need large numbers. They needed silence and patience. For most Australian troops in Vietnam, combat was loud and chaotic. Ambushes, mortars, firefights. But for the SASR, battle was something else entirely. It was about silence, timing, and striking from the dark with surgical precision. These weren't firefights fought in numbers. They were chess matches, with lives on the line. Mission 1. The ambush at Long Green. It was late afternoon when the 6-man patrol took position on a narrow jungle trail in the Long Green, a stretch of dense forest favored by VC couriers and patrol units. They set claymore mines in a perfect arc, each one loaded with 700 steel ball bearings. Then they waited. Hours passed. Heat faded. Mosquitoes buzzed. Then, movement. A VC patrol, 6 men strong, walked straight into the kill zone. The lead soldier passed the final trip marker. The patrol commander whispered, "Fire!" Boom! 2 claymores exploded in perfect sequence. The first 3 enemy soldiers were obliterated. The others scattered. The SAS opened fire for just 7 seconds, dropped 2 more enemies, then melted into the jungle. They were extracted within 20 minutes. No friendly casualties. Mission success. Mission 2. 10 days in the Long High Hills. Not all missions ended in gunfire. A team inserted by helicopter into the Long High Hills, an area crawling with VC units and fortified bunkers. Their task? Observe, report, and call in support. They moved just 300 meters a day, sleeping in spider holes, bearing waste, and covering every trace of movement. They spotted an enemy battalion-sized camp camouflaged beneath the canopy. For 8 days, they tracked movement, counted soldiers, and mapped bunkers. On day 10, they called in a coordinated airstrike and artillery barrage. The jungle erupted, fire and steel tearing through VC positions. Afterward, ground units moved in and found dozens of dead fighters and destroyed infrastructure, all made possible by 6 silent Australians, lying in wait with binoculars, maps, and a radio. Mission 3, contact with D445 VC Battalion. Not every mission went smoothly. During a surveillance patrol near Phuoc Tuy, a SAS team encountered unexpected movement. A D445 battalion patrol was closer than anticipated. The team went prone, camouflaged under foliage. But the enemy moved toward them. Too close, too fast. Then a crack. Someone had stepped on dry bamboo. The jungle erupted with AK fire. The patrol returned fire immediately, suppressing the enemy long enough to call for urgent extraction. Within 15 minutes, a Huey roared in low, dodging incoming rounds. The team popped red smoke, sprinted from cover under fire, and leapt aboard as the door gunners raked the jungle. One SAS soldier took shrapnel to the leg, but they all made it out. It was chaotic, close, and nearly fatal. Neutralized enemy units before they could launch attacks. Exposed VC supply chains, allowing artillery and air power to strike with precision. For conventional Australian infantry, the SASR were the eyes in the dark. The reason they could move through hostile zones with a fighting chance. But their legacy didn't stop in Vietnam. The experience forged in that jungle would shape Australia's modern special forces doctrine for decades. Tactics, training, and selection processes used by today's SAS operators still trace their roots back to Vietnam. And when the War on Terror came decades later, in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, it was the SASR veterans of Vietnam who trained the next generation. They passed on more than knowledge. They passed on a mindset: don't be seen, don't be heard. But when the time comes, act with overwhelming precision. Their story was almost forgotten, but their impact, permanent. They didn't just change how Australia fought. They helped define what it means to be truly elite. The Vietnam War is often remembered for its politics, its protests, and its tragedies. But behind all of that were warriors who fought in silence. The men of the Australian SASR didn't seek fame. They didn't ask for glory. They asked for a mission, and they completed it every single time. They operated alone. They watched unseen. And when the moment came, they struck with speed and fury, then disappeared into the jungle. They were never supposed to be noticed. But now it's time we remember them. So to the ghost warriors who patrolled where others wouldn't go, this story is for you. And to those who never came home, we honor you. Thank you for watching. If you believe these stories deserve to be told, please consider giving this video a like, leaving a comment, and hitting subscribe. It helps us bring forgotten history back to life. This was the hidden war of the Australian SAS in Vietnam. We'll see you next time for another story that history almost erased. Until then, stay sharp, stay curious, and never forget. Neutralized enemy units before they could launch attacks. Expose VC supply chains, allowing artillery and air power to strike with precision. For conventional Australian infantry, the SASR were the eyes in the dark. The reason they could move through hostile zones with a fighting chance. But their legacy didn't stop in Vietnam. The experience forged in that jungle would shape Australia's modern special forces doctrine for decades. Tactics, training, and selection processes used by today's SAS operators still trace their roots back to Vietnam. And when the War on Terror came decades later, in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, it was the SASR veterans of Vietnam who trained the next generation. They passed on more than knowledge. They passed on a mindset: don't be seen, don't be heard. But when the time comes, act with overwhelming precision. Their story was almost forgotten, but their impact, permanent. They didn't just change how Australia fought. They helped define what it means to be truly elite. The Vietnam War is often remembered for its politics, its protests, and its tragedies. But behind all of that were warriors who fought in silence. The men of the Australian SASR didn't seek fame. They didn't ask for glory. They asked for a mission, and they completed it every single time. They operated alone. They watched unseen. And when the moment came, they struck with speed and fury, then disappeared into the jungle. They were never supposed to be noticed. But now it's time we remember them. So to the ghost warriors who patrolled where others wouldn't go, this story is for you. And to those who never came home, we honor you. Thank you for watching. If you believe these stories deserve to be told, please consider giving this video a like, leaving a comment, and hitting subscribe. It helps us bring forgotten history back to life. This was the hidden war of the Australian SAS in Vietnam. We'll see you next time for another story that history almost erased. Until then, stay sharp, stay curious, and never forget. In the dense jungles of South Vietnam, during the spring of 1970, a group of Australian and New Zealand soldiers moved quietly through the shadows. They weren't looking for a major battle, nor were they equipped with the firepower of an American division. Their mission was simple: patrol, search, disrupt the Viet Cong in their hidden strongholds. What they didn't know was that they were about to stumble on something extraordinary, something no one expected. On April 8th, deep in Phuoc Tuy province, a routine patrol of the Anzac Battalion uncovered a well-hidden enemy base. At first glance, it looked like just another Viet Cong bunker system, the kind they had seen many times before. But inside lay a prize so valuable that it would be called the biggest intelligence coup of the entire Vietnam War. This was Operation Townsville. It wasn't a large-scale clash like Long Tan, nor a prolonged siege like Khe Sanh. Instead, it was a small, sharp encounter where a handful of soldiers turned the tide of intelligence warfare. In a single moment, they captured the enemy's codes, their cipher pads, and the keys to breaking open Viet Cong communications across southern Vietnam. This was the kind of victory that didn't make the evening headlines. But in the war rooms of Saigon and Washington, it was priceless. And before we dive in, 90% of viewers who watch these videos aren't subscribed. If you enjoy forgotten stories of the Vietnam War, make sure to hit like and subscribe. We're on a mission to reach 15,000 subscribers, and your support makes a huge difference. So now let's go back to 1970 and see how a small Anzac patrol changed the course of the war. By 1970, the Vietnam War had already dragged on for more than a decade. The United States carried the heaviest burden, with 500,000 troops spread across South Vietnam. But America was not alone. Alongside them fought allies: South Korea, Thailand, the Philippines, and smaller but highly professional forces from Australia and New Zealand. Australia's involvement began with military advisors in 1962. By 1965, combat units were deployed, and the first Australian task force, 1ATF, was formed the following year. Their base was at Nui Yat in Phuoc Tuy Province, a coastal region east of Saigon. Phuoc Tuy was no random choice. Its geography, thick jungles, rubber plantations, and remote villages, made it a natural Viet Cong stronghold. Local guerrilla units, along with the well-trained D445 Battalion, operated from hidden bases here. For the Australians, it was the perfect place to apply their specialty: long-range patrols, ambushes, and counterinsurgency warfare. New Zealand joined the fight by sending artillery and infantry companies that integrated directly with Australian battalions. This gave birth to the Anzac battalions, mixed formations of Australians and New Zealanders that fought as one. The 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 6RAR, was one of these units. Its men had already carved their place in history at Long Tan in 1966, where they faced overwhelming Viet Cong forces and held their ground. By 1970, 6RAR was back in Phuoc Tuy, working side by side with the Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment. But the situation was changing. America was beginning its policy of Vietnamization, handing over more responsibility to South Vietnamese forces while planning to withdraw its own. Allies like Australia faced the same pressure. Every battalion knew its time was limited. For 6RAR, Operation Townsville would be their final operation before going home. Nobody could have guessed that this last mission would deliver one of the most important intelligence victories of the entire war. By early 1970, the war in South Vietnam was shifting. Across the country, U.S. troop numbers were starting to fall as Washington pushed forward with its Vietnamization policy. The idea was simple: South Vietnamese forces would take over the fighting, while American and Allied units slowly pulled back. But on the ground, the war was anything but simple. In Phuoc Tuy Province, the Australians and New Zealanders of the 1st Australian Task Force knew the enemy well. The Viet Cong provincial headquarters had operated there for years, hidden deep in the jungle. It was the brain that directed ambushes, coordinated supply lines, and spread propaganda among the villages. Despite years of patrolling, the headquarters itself had remained elusive, always one step ahead. For 6RAR, time was running out. Their tour in Vietnam was nearly finished, and soon they would be rotated home. But before leaving, they were tasked with one more operation: a search and destroy mission in the northeast of Phuoc Tuy. The mission would be called Operation Townsville, after the Australian city. It wasn't planned as a grand offensive. The goal was steady, methodical pressure: patrol the jungle, disrupt the enemy, and, if possible, locate bases and supply caches. The responsibility fell heavily on the Anzac Battalion, a combined force of Australians and New Zealanders. The spearhead would be V4 Company of the Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment, soon joined by W3 Company for reinforcement. Together with 6RAR, they would sweep through one of the most dangerous regions of the province. What they couldn't know was that this routine operation, just another patrol, just another sweep through the thick, unforgiving jungle, would lead them straight to the hidden heart of the enemy in Phuoc Tuy. And in a single firefight, everything would change. On the 23rd of March 1970, Operation Townsville began. The men of 6RAR and their New Zealand brothers from V4 Company moved out from Nui Yat into the dense, unforgiving jungle northeast of Phuoc Tuy Province. Their mission was straightforward on paper: conduct long-range patrols, sweep the area for Viet Cong activity, and apply constant pressure on enemy forces. But this wasn't a war of grand maneuvers or massive armored columns. The Australians and New Zealanders fought differently than their American allies. Where U.S. divisions often launched large-scale search and destroy operations with thousands of troops, artillery, and helicopters, the Anzac style was quieter, more deliberate. They specialized in small unit patrolling, squads and platoons moving silently through the jungle, spreading out, listening, and waiting for signs of the enemy. Instead of charging into villages with overwhelming force, they relied on stealth, patience, and ambush tactics. This made them particularly effective in Phuoc Tuy, where the Viet Cong thrived in hidden camps and supply routes. The terrain was their constant enemy. The northeast of Phuoc Tuy was thick with tangled jungle, steep slopes, and suffocating humidity. Every movement was slow, deliberate, and exhausting. Booby traps, punji stakes, and tripwires could be anywhere. Leeches clung to the soldiers' skin, and the heat turned every march into an endurance test. Over the first days of the operation, patrols uncovered small camps, supply caches, and signs of recent enemy activity, but no major contact. The men pushed deeper into the green labyrinth, alert with every step. Their commanders knew this was Viet Cong territory. Somewhere out there, hidden in the jungle, was the enemy's provincial headquarters. The Australians and New Zealanders were about to find it, but only after weeks of tension, careful movement, and one sudden violent encounter that would change everything. For 2 weeks, the patrols of Operation Townsville pressed deeper into the northeast of Phuoc Tuy province. The Anzac soldiers moved cautiously, their eyes scanning for tripwires, their ears tuned to the faintest sound of movement. They found abandoned camps, hidden storage pits, and trails that spoke of Viet Cong supply lines. But the enemy itself stayed in the shadows, just out of reach. That changed on the 8th of April, 1970. On that morning, V4 Company of the Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment was moving through dense jungle when scouts noticed fresh signs of enemy movement. Footprints, disturbed vegetation, the faint smell of smoke from a hidden cooking fire. The company spread out, rifles raised, hearts pounding. They were closing in. Suddenly, gunfire erupted. Viet Cong fighters concealed in bunkers opened fire at close range. The jungle exploded with the crack of rifles and the thunder of automatic fire. The New Zealanders returned fire, advancing cautiously under cover. Grenades arced into the bunkers, sending shockwaves through the trees. The firefight was sharp and violent, but the ANZACS pressed forward with discipline. Within minutes, they had driven the enemy from their positions. When the shooting died down, the soldiers moved in to search the site. What they found stunned them. This wasn't just another bunker complex. They had stumbled onto the headquarters of the Viet Cong Ba Long Province Committee, the nerve center of enemy activity in Phuoc Tuy. Inside the bunkers were stacks of documents, radios, maps, and, most critically, coded signals books and one-time cipher pads. At first, the men didn't realize the full value of what they had captured. To them, it looked like piles of paperwork. But when intelligence officers later examined the haul, the truth became clear. They had broken into the enemy's communications heart. The Viet Cong had just suffered a devastating blow. The battle itself was small, barely a skirmish compared to the huge clashes elsewhere in Vietnam. But in that brief firefight, a handful of Anzac soldiers had achieved what countless large-scale sweeps had failed to do. They had ripped open the secrecy of the Viet Cong command. When the shooting stopped on April 8th, the soldiers of V4 Company began sifting through the captured bunkers. At first, the haul looked like nothing more than paperwork and field gear, the kind of clutter found in many abandoned Viet Cong camps. But there was something different here. Stacked neatly in boxes and bags were operational files, signal logs, and, most importantly, the enemy's cryptographic tools. Among them were one-time cipher pads and code books used by the Viet Cong provincial headquarters. These weren't just routine notes. They were the keys to the enemy's hidden language. For years, the Viet Cong had relied on encrypted radio transmissions to coordinate movements, supply lines, and attacks. Their one-time cipher pads were designed to be unbreakable, with each set used only once before being destroyed. Capturing them intact was almost unheard of. Yet here they were, seized from the very heart of the enemy's command structure. As the material was rushed back to Nui Jat and then to higher intelligence centers, the scale of the find became clear. Analysts quickly realized that they could read Viet Cong communications in real time. Suddenly, Allied forces could anticipate movements, intercept supply runs, and disrupt planned offensives before they even began. General Creighton Abrams, the commander of all U.S. forces in Vietnam, was stunned by the magnitude of the breakthrough. He described it as the biggest intelligence coup of the entire war. Coming from a man who had overseen countless operations across the country, that praise carried enormous weight. The documents also revealed the structure of the Viet Cong network in Phuoc Tuy province. They outlined chains of command, village contacts, and the links between local guerrillas and main force units, like the D445 Battalion. For the Australians and New Zealanders, who had been battling these shadowy enemies for years, the find was like pulling back a curtain. The hidden enemy was now exposed. The intelligence windfall had immediate effects. Allied patrols began ambushing Viet Cong units with uncanny timing. Supply caches were discovered and destroyed. Planned enemy attacks were blunted before they could even start. The Viet Cong in Phuoc Tuy found themselves hunted in ways they had never experienced before. All of this came from a single firefight, fought by a single company in the middle of the jungle on an otherwise unremarkable April day. Operation Townsville had just rewritten the intelligence game in South Vietnam. The discovery made during Operation Townsville was more than just a lucky break. It had immediate and far-reaching consequences for the war in Phuoc Tuy province and beyond. In the short term, the captured codes and cipher pads allowed Allied intelligence teams to listen in on enemy plans. Patrols from the 1st Australian Task Force suddenly had the upper hand. They could anticipate Viet Cong resupply missions, intercept couriers, and prepare ambushes along jungle tracks that, until then, had been invisible. For the Viet Cong, it was a nightmare. The province headquarters had been the brain of their operations, directing D445 Battalion, guiding guerrilla cells, and keeping pressure on villages. Now, with their communications compromised, their ability to coordinate was shattered. Small victories soon followed. Australian and New Zealand patrols dismantled supply dumps, disrupted recruiting efforts, and forced the enemy further into hiding. At a wider level, the intelligence was shared with U.S. forces across Third Corps, the military zone that stretched from Saigon eastward into the provinces. The material offered insights into enemy networks, supply chains, and political structures that had long frustrated American commanders. For once, they had a clear window into how the Viet Cong thought and operated. Perhaps most importantly, Operation Townsville proved the value of the ANZAC approach. While American divisions often relied on massive sweeps, helicopters, and overwhelming firepower, the Australians and New Zealanders showed how methodical patrolling and persistence could yield results just as decisive and sometimes far more valuable. In the end, the intelligence coup was not a dramatic battlefield victory. There were no soaring casualty figures, no captured cities, no destroyed regiments. Instead, it was a victory of patience, stealth, and discipline. A small band of Anzac soldiers had outsmarted the enemy and delivered a blow that reshaped the intelligence war in Vietnam. By late April 1970, Operation Townsville came to an end. The sweep through the northeast of Phuoc Tuy had delivered more than anyone could have expected. The bunkers were cleared, supply lines disrupted, and the intelligence hall was already shaping operations far beyond the province. But for the men of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, the operation carried an even deeper meaning. It was their last mission in Vietnam. After years of service, countless patrols and battles that had etched their names into military history, 6RAR was preparing to go home. In May 1970, the battalion was officially withdrawn and replaced by 2RAR, continuing the rotation of Australian battalions in Phuoc Tuy. For the soldiers, it was a moment of pride and reflection. They had arrived in Vietnam as part of a larger war effort, and they left knowing that their final operation had delivered a blow that commanders at the highest level called one of the war's greatest intelligence triumphs. The men who had once faced overwhelming odds at Long Tan in 1966 now ended their Vietnam service not with another massive battle, but with a quiet, calculated success: the capture of the enemy's secrets. It was a fitting farewell for a unit that had become known for discipline, resilience, and professionalism in one of the most unforgiving wars of the 20th century. Operation Townsville was not an isolated story. It was one chapter in a much larger record of service by the Australian and New Zealand forces in Vietnam. From the earliest days of the war, Both nations committed themselves to supporting South Vietnam and their American allies. For Australia, this began with small numbers of advisors in 1962, but by 1966, it had grown into a full combat deployment. The creation of the first Australian task force, 1ATF, at Nui Yat, gave Canberra an independent command responsible for securing the whole of Phuoc Tuy province. New Zealand's role was smaller in numbers, but equally significant in spirit. Instead of deploying large formations, Wellington sent artillery batteries and infantry companies. These companies were paired directly with Australian battalions, forming the ANZAC battalions. The partnership ran deep. Australians and New Zealanders trained, patrolled, and fought side by side as a single force. Together, the Anzacs developed a reputation for professionalism and effectiveness. Their methodical patrolling style, patience in the field, and skill at counterinsurgency made them well-suited for Phuoc Thai's demanding terrain. Major operations like Long Tan, Bribie, Coral Balmoral, and finally Townsville highlighted the crucial role they played. While their numbers were small compared to the Americans, their impact was outsized. For many U.S. commanders, the ANZACS became a model of how to fight the Viet Cong on their own terms. And with Operation Townsville, the partnership delivered not just another tactical win, but a breakthrough that shifted the entire intelligence war. In the vast history of the Vietnam War, Operation Townsville is not a household name. It doesn't appear in the same breath as Tet, Hue, or Khe Sanh. Yet for those who fought in Phuoc Tuy province, and for those who studied the intelligence war, it stands out as one of the most decisive small unit victories of the entire conflict. The firefight on April 8th was short, sharp, and easily overshadowed by larger battles raging elsewhere in Vietnam. But the impact of what was captured that day cannot be overstated. The seizure of Viet Cong cipher pads and codes gave Allied forces a rare and fleeting glimpse directly into the enemy's communications. For weeks, they could anticipate attacks, uncover supply networks, and neutralize plans before they materialized. For the Australians and New Zealanders, Operation Townsville became a powerful reminder of what discipline, patience, and persistence could achieve. It validated their approach to the war: long patrols, quiet ambushes, steady pressure, rather than relying solely on overwhelming firepower. The operation also marked a symbolic close to 6 RAR's Vietnam service. From the bloody clash at Long Tan in 1966 to the quiet but decisive success at Townsville in 1970, the battalion's journey reflected the arc of Australia's involvement in Vietnam. Courage in battle, endurance in the field, and professionalism to the very end. Today, Townsville is remembered by veterans and historians not as a grand battle, but as a turning point in the intelligence war. It showed that sometimes the most important victories weren't measured in body counts or territory gained, but in secrets uncovered. It was proof that even in the twilight of Australia's commitment to Vietnam, the Anzacs could still change the course of the fight. Operation Townsville wasn't a headline-grabbing battle. It didn't leave behind wrecked tanks or endless casualty lists. Instead, it was a victory won in silence, with discipline, patience, and one incredible stroke of luck that turned into the biggest intelligence coup of the Vietnam War. For the men of 6 RAR and their New Zealand comrades, it was the perfect final chapter in Vietnam. They had fought a hidden enemy, and in their last operation, they uncovered the enemy's deepest secrets. General Crichton Abrams himself admitted it. The Anzacs had achieved something extraordinary. And just like these forgotten victories deserve to be remembered, our channel has its own mission. We're aiming for 15,000 subscribers. Right now, more than 90% of viewers aren't subscribed. And with just one click, you can help us reach that goal. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more hidden chapters of the Vietnam War, hit like and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more of these untold stories to life, and it keeps this channel growing stronger every week. Thank you for watching, and thank you for being part of this mission. Together we'll hit 15,000. Late January 1968, just days before the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. Deep in the jungle northeast of Saigon, Australian soldiers were patrolling unfamiliar ground. The terrain was thick, broken, and hostile, but not quiet. There were signs everywhere: fresh tracks, recently abandoned camps, unused ammunition stacked beside foxholes. Something was coming, and then it did. The first shot shattered the stillness. Automatic fire tore through the trees, mortars thumped in the distance. One patrol was hit, then another. Fire support bases Anderson and Harrison came under attack. But this wasn't just a local skirmish. It was the opening wave of one of the most explosive campaigns of the entire Vietnam War. The Tet Offensive had begun, and while the world's attention shifted to the battle for Saigon, Australian troops found themselves in the path of a major enemy thrust aimed at U.S. command and logistics hubs. The Australians weren't just holding the line, they were fighting to plug a critical gap in the Allied defenses. Operation Coburg was never meant to be history-making, but as Viet Cong forces surged across the country, the men of the 1st Australian Task Force stood in their way cut off, heavily outnumbered and under fire from all sides. This is the story of how Australian troops helped stop the Tet Offensive from turning into a total collapse, and why almost no one talks about it. By early 1968, the Vietnam War was about to change. The United States had poured hundreds of thousands of troops into South Vietnam. Major bases like Bien Hoa Air Base and the massive Long Binh logistics hub just north of Saigon had become essential to the war effort. They housed aircraft, artillery, command infrastructure, fuel depots, and tens of thousands of American and ARVN personnel. But intelligence reports were troubling. There were whispers of large enemy formations massing outside Saigon. Intercepts suggested that North Vietnamese and Viet Cong units were moving into position along jungle trails and hidden supply routes. Their target wasn't clear, but the threat was growing by the day. The Americans called for help. In a rare move, the Australian government authorized the 1st Australian Task Force, 1st ATF, to operate outside its usual area in Phuoc Tuy Province. It was the first time in the war that Australian forces would deploy to protect an American sector. The mission was codenamed Operation Coburg. Their orders: establish fire support bases northeast of Bien Hoa, conduct deep jungle patrols, ambush enemy forces, and deny the Viet Cong access to key approach routes into Saigon's northern flank. It was a risky deployment. The area was unfamiliar, heavily forested, and known to be crawling with VC. But the Australians accepted the mission and moved quickly. Fire support bases Anderson and Harrison were constructed under pressure, and within days, Australian patrols were in contact with enemy forces. What no one knew, not yet, was that the North Vietnamese were about to launch a massive, coordinated assault across all of South Vietnam. And Operation Coburg would place Australian troops directly in the path of one of its deadliest thrusts. While the world would remember the Tet Offensive for what happened in Hue and Saigon, it was in these jungles, far from the TV cameras, that the Australians would face some of their hardest, most critical fighting of the war. And they would do it quietly, outnumbered, outgunned, but not outmatched. On January 24, 1968, elements of the 1st Australian Task Force moved out of Phuoc Tuy Province and into the dense jungle northeast of Bien Hoa, deep inside enemy territory. It was unfamiliar ground. The Australians had spent nearly 2 years fighting Viet Cong guerrillas in their own province. But this was something else entirely. The terrain in the Coburg area of operations was tougher, wetter, and riddled with canal systems, tracks, and concealed enemy positions. It was classic Viet Cong country, and they knew it far better than the Australians did. Within days, the Australians established Fire Support Base Anderson, followed shortly by FSB Harrison. These hastily constructed bases would become the backbone of Operation Coburg. Artillery guns were dug in. Concertina wire was strung around makeshift perimeters. Observation posts were placed, and patrols began. Immediately, the signs were clear the enemy was already there. Fresh boot prints, recently used bunkers, abandoned cooking fires, small arms fire in the distance. It wasn't just an active area, it was a staging ground. Unbeknownst to the Australians, they were now operating right in the middle of a key North Vietnamese approach corridor into Long Binh and Bien Hoa. A corridor the NVA had no intention of giving up without a fight. Every patrol sent out from the firebases found something. Signs of movement, VC runners, snipers, or direct contact. Ambushes became routine. By the third day, Australian soldiers were already taking fire from multiple directions. And yet, there was no full-scale battle. Not yet. The jungle was holding its breath. Then came the intel reports, intercepts, sudden radio traffic, suspicious quiet in enemy-held zones. Something was building, something massive. What the Australians didn't know, but were about to find out, was that they were standing in the path of the largest communist offensive of the entire war. And when it came, there would be no warning. By the final days of January, the jungle around Fire Support Base Anderson was alive with tension. Every patrol from the 1st Australian Task Force reported signs of enemy movement. Not just small units or guerrilla groups, but large organized forces moving along concealed tracks. Some patrols discovered freshly dug bunkers and ammunition caches. Others stumbled across recently vacated campfires still smoldering. The Viet Cong were close. Too close. Then the shooting started. The first major contact came when a platoon-sized patrol encountered a heavily armed VC force near a canal line east of FSB Anderson. The Australians walked into a deliberate ambush. RPGs exploded from the tree line, machine guns opened up in short, accurate bursts, and enemy snipers fired from concealed positions. The patrol returned fire immediately, using suppressive bursts and calling in artillery support from Anderson. It was a sharp, vicious engagement, and it wouldn't be the last. Throughout the following days, contacts became more frequent and more intense. Enemy forces showed a level of coordination not normally seen in smaller skirmishes. There were signs the Viet Cong were probing the firebases, testing their defenses, measuring the response time of Australian artillery and air support. The Australians adapted fast. Patrols were reinforced with armored personnel carriers. Artillery fire was pre-planned and coordinated with movement. Sniper teams were deployed to cover vulnerable approach routes. The dense jungle was becoming a chessboard, and the Australians were determined not to be outplayed. But there was something deeper, more ominous behind it all. The enemy wasn't just defending terrain, they were preparing for something. The constant engagements weren't just harassment, they were cover, diversions, distractions. And intelligence reports filtering in from US and ARVN sources hinted at something massive moving behind enemy lines. Back at Anderson, radio operators picked up strange traffic. Forward observers reported increased movement at night. Tunnels were found, abandoned in haste. Something was about to break, and it would break on the night of January 30th, with an explosion of violence that would stretch from Saigon to Hue and right through the Australian perimeter at Coburg. The Tet Offensive had begun. By the final days of January, the jungle around Fire Support Base Anderson was alive with tension. Every patrol from the 1st Australian Task Force reported signs of enemy movement. Not just small units or guerrilla groups, but large organized forces moving along concealed tracks. Some patrols discovered freshly dug bunkers and ammunition caches. Others stumbled across recently vacated campfires still smoldering. The Viet Cong were close. Too close. Then the shooting started. The first major contact came when a platoon-sized patrol encountered a heavily armed VC force near a canal line east of FSB Anderson. The Australians walked into a deliberate ambush. RPGs exploded from the tree line. Machine guns opened up in short, accurate bursts, and enemy snipers fired from concealed positions. The patrol returned fire immediately, using suppressive bursts and calling in artillery support from Anderson. It was a sharp, vicious engagement, and it wouldn't be the last. Throughout the following days, contacts became more frequent and more intense. Enemy forces showed a level of coordination not normally seen in smaller skirmishes. There were signs the Viet Cong were probing the firebases, testing their defenses, measuring the response time of Australian artillery and air support. The Australians adapted fast. Patrols were reinforced with armored personnel carriers. Artillery fire was pre-planned and coordinated with movement. Sniper teams were deployed to cover vulnerable approach routes. The dense jungle was becoming a chessboard, and the Australians were determined not to be outplayed. But there was something deeper, more ominous behind it all. The enemy wasn't just defending terrain, they were preparing for something. The constant engagements weren't just harassment, they were cover, diversions, distractions, and intelligence reports filtering in from US and ARVN sources hinted at something massive moving behind enemy lines. Back at Anderson, radio operators picked up strange traffic. Forward observers reported increased movement at night. Tunnels were found, abandoned in haste. Something was about to break, and it would break on the night of January 30th, with an explosion of violence that would stretch from Saigon to Hue and right through the Australian perimeter at Coburg. The Tet Offensive had begun. At 3 a.m. on January 30th, the night sky lit up with flashes and thunderclaps of incoming fire. Across South Vietnam, communist forces launched a massive, coordinated assault that would come to define the war, the Tet Offensive. More than 80,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army troops struck over 100 towns and cities simultaneously, including Saigon, Hue, Da Nang, and crucially, Bien Hoa and Long Binh, the very installations Operation Cobberg had been tasked to protect. At Fire Support Base Anderson, the Australians were already on edge from days of contact. When the mortars started falling, they were ready. Enemy rounds landed inside the perimeter. The base shook under the impact. Shrapnel tore through sandbags, vehicles, and dugouts. Australian gunners scrambled to man their 105mm artillery, returning fire in all directions. Troops ran to their posts, some still pulling on their boots. The base had been partially hardened, but not enough to prevent damage, and the enemy wasn't done. While rocket attacks slammed Anderson and nearby FSB Harrison, enemy infantry probed the wire, looking for weaknesses. These weren't random attacks. They were coordinated attempts to breach the fire bases and open corridors for Viet Cong units pushing toward Long Binh and Bien Hoa. But the Australians held. Patrols were pushed out to intercept. Infantry sections engaged in running battles through jungle clearings and along canal lines. One contact saw an entire VC assault squad wiped out by a coordinated infantry APC ambush just kilometers from the base. In another, a team of sappers was intercepted trying to emplace mines along a track used by U.S. supply convoys. The stakes were enormous. If the enemy broke through the Australian screen, they would have a direct route into Long Binh, home to thousands of U.S. troops, fuel depots, and one of the largest logistics centers in Southeast Asia. Despite being outnumbered, the Australians used superior training, jungle fighting experience, and relentless artillery support to keep the enemy at bay. Every engagement delayed, diverted, or disrupted VC operations. Coordination was key. Australian artillery batteries fired thousands of rounds in support of U.S. and ARVN units under siege elsewhere. Helicopter gunships flew low over the jungle, laying down rockets and minigun fire to halt enemy columns. And still, the Australians pushed further into enemy territory, hunting down VC formations that were trying to regroup after failed Tet attacks. The men of 1AT weren't holding the capital or defending television stations, but they were holding something just as vital, the enemy's front door. For over a week, they fought under constant threat. Fire bases were mortared almost nightly. Patrols left every morning not knowing if they'd return. Yet morale held, discipline held, and the line held. In the chaos of Tet, while cities burned and headlines screamed of collapse, the Australians in Operation Cobberg stood firm. And because they did, the enemy never reached their full objective. Throughout the first week of the Tet Offensive, fire support bases Anderson and Harrison became prime targets. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong understood that these positions were more than artillery outposts. They were shields. As long as the Australians held them, enemy forces couldn't push toward Bien Hoa or Long Binh without being seen, shelled, or stopped outright. So they hit them hard. Night after night, enemy mortar teams opened fire from the jungle. Some rounds hit their mark, blowing apart defensive wire, damaging bunkers, and injuring men caught in the open. The soldiers quickly adapted, reinforcing fighting positions, setting up counter-mortar patrols, and hardening perimeters with extra sandbags, claymores, and trip flares. Every man on base, infantry, engineers, artillery, signalers, had a job to do, and every one of them knew the enemy was watching. The artillery crews worked around the clock, responding to fire missions in support of both Australian patrols and U.S. and ARVN forces engaged elsewhere in the Tet battles. Some days saw thousands of rounds fired. Every shell sent downrange disrupted enemy columns, hit supply routes, or broke up attacks before they reached populated areas. Casualties mounted, but morale remained unshaken. Medical teams treated shrapnel wounds and concussion injuries in makeshift field hospitals. Mechanics worked under fire to keep vehicles running. Signal teams coordinated with American gunships and Allied ground units. It was a full-spectrum defense, a team effort under extreme pressure. Then came the closest call. One night, enemy sappers attempted to breach FSB Harrison's wire under the cover of mortar fire. Armed with satchel charges and grenades, they slipped through gaps in the jungle and crawled toward the base. But they were spotted. Flares lit the perimeter. Machine guns opened up, and the sappers were cut down just meters from the edge. The fire bases held, not by chance, but by grit, coordination, and a refusal to yield. The enemy had hoped to knock the Australians out early in Tet. Instead, they found two fortified bastions that refused to break. By mid-February 1968, the Tet Offensive had begun to lose momentum. Across South Vietnam, Allied forces were pushing back. In Saigon, U.S. and ARVN troops had retaken major government buildings. In Hue, brutal house-to-house fighting was slowly turning in the Allies' favor. And in the jungles northeast of Bien Hoa, the Australians of Operation Coburg had done their part, and more. The enemy had been denied access to vital routes. Repeated attempts to push through to Long Binh and Bien Hoa had been intercepted, repelled, or shattered before they could gain ground. The fire bases had held. Patrols had remained aggressive, and the enemy's window of surprise had been slammed shut. With the immediate threat fading, 1 ATF began withdrawing from the Coburg area in early March. Fire support bases Anderson and Harrison were dismantled. Artillery units packed up. Infantry companies loaded into APCs and helicopters. What was left behind was a devastated landscape. Cratered jungle, destroyed bunkers, spent shell casings, and the quiet knowledge of a job completed under fire. The cost had been real. 10 Australian soldiers were killed during Operation Coburg. 52 more were wounded. The confirmed enemy dead numbered over 145, with many more believed to have been killed or wounded in unrecorded engagements deep in the jungle. But beyond the numbers, Coburg had proven something vital, that Australian troops could deploy fast, hold ground, and disrupt major enemy movements on a scale far larger than their numbers suggested. They had protected key American positions when it mattered most, and they had done it while the rest of the world focused on Saigon's burning embassies and televised chaos. The battle for Coburg was over, but its impact would echo far beyond the jungle. Operation Coburg never made the front pages. While the world watched dramatic footage from Saigon and Hue, Australian troops were fighting and winning in a dense, silent corner of the war, far from the cameras and headlines. There were no urban ruins, no embassy sieges, no political theater. Just disciplined soldiers holding a jungle line under fire, keeping pressure on the enemy when the entire front was threatening to collapse. Today, Coburg is recognized by military historians as a critical, if understated, component of the Tet Offensive response. Without the 1st Australian Task Force holding the northeast approaches, the Viet Cong might have broken through to Long Binh, the logistical lifeline of the U.S. military in South Vietnam. If that had happened, the chaos of Tet could have spiraled into an even greater disaster. For the soldiers who fought there, Coburg became one of the defining campaigns of their Vietnam service. It showcased everything the Australian Army had built since arriving in country: rapid mobility, jungle warfare skill, discipline under pressure, and seamless integration of artillery and infantry. And while it was one of the few times Australia committed troops outside its assigned province, it proved they could operate in any zone, alongside any Allied force, and deliver results that mattered. Coburg never sought recognition. It was a quiet operation in the shadow of louder battles. But for those who were there, and for those who study what could have happened if they hadn't been, it remains one of the most successful and strategically vital missions of Australia's Vietnam War. Operation Coburg was never meant to be remembered. It was a support mission, a quiet deployment into a patch of jungle no one could find on a map. But when the Tet Offensive exploded across Vietnam, the men of the 1st Australian Task Force were already in position, and they held that position against artillery, against ambushes, against the odds. They weren't in the capital. They weren't on the evening news, but they were exactly where they needed to be, and they made sure the enemy didn't get any further. These are the stories that often get lost in the shadow of history, not because they're less important, but because they were fought by soldiers who didn't ask for recognition. They just did their job, and they did it with quiet courage. If you found this video valuable, consider leaving a like, sharing it with someone who respects military history, and subscribing to the channel. It helps us bring forgotten battles like this back to light, and to the veterans of Operation Coburg and the families who carry their memory, thank you. And to you, the viewer, thanks for watching. The sun hadn't broken through the canopy for hours. August 6, 1967, deep in the Vietnamese jungle, a company of the 7th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment was pushing through dense terrain near Suoi Chau Pa. It was supposed to be just another patrol, part of a wider clearing operation, but something felt off. The ground was freshly disturbed. Jungle paths looked too clean. The silence wasn't natural. The men tightened their spacing. Weapons were raised. Every step was heavier than the last. And then it hit. A deafening burst of gunfire erupted from both flanks. Machine guns raked the trees. RPGs slammed into the undergrowth, and grenades exploded in bursts of smoke and dirt. The Australians had stumbled into a perfectly prepared Viet Cong ambush, and they were outnumbered. Pinned down and bleeding, they returned fire, inching behind tree roots and termite mounds. Radio calls screamed for artillery support. Medics crawled under fire. One section fought off an entire assault with bayonets and grenades. This wasn't a battle, it was survival. Within minutes, the jungle was a war zone. This is the story of Suoi Chau Pa, where Australian soldiers were forced to fight for their lives in one of the most intense close-quarter engagements of the entire Vietnam War. And almost nobody talks about it. By mid-1967, Australian forces in Vietnam had settled into a deadly rhythm. Patrol, ambush, clear, repeat. The 1st Australian Task Force, Jet-1 ATF, based at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy Province, was tasked with keeping the region clear of Viet Cong forces, particularly the elusive but dangerous D445 Battalion, a local VC unit known for its hit-and-run tactics, deep jungle knowledge, and near-mythical ability to disappear into the bush. At this point in the war, Australia had refined its approach to counterinsurgency. Large-scale operations were supported by constant patrolling aimed at cutting off enemy movement, locating base camps, and ambushing supply routes. It was dangerous, exhausting work, but it was working. In early August, 7RAR launched Operation Ballarat, a wide-ranging search and destroy mission in the area northwest of Nui Dat, near the Suoi Chau Pa stream. Intelligence had hinted at enemy activity, recent sightings, trails, and possible resupply efforts, but nothing suggested what was waiting in the jungle. The goal was simple: send companies out to sweep the region, disrupt enemy movements, and clear any VC concentrations that might be preparing attacks or reinforcing positions. A company under the command of Major Ewart O'Donnell was tasked with patrolling one of the most difficult and remote sections. It was rough ground, overgrown, shadowed, and ideal for concealment, the kind of terrain where an ambush could happen in an instant and without warning. And that's exactly what would unfold. The Viet Cong weren't running. They weren't hiding. They were waiting. Unknown to the Australians, a significant force from D445 Battalion had dug in near Suoi Chau Pa. They were well-armed, disciplined, and prepared to fight. The Australians would be walking into the kind of battle they trained for, but hoped they'd never have to face. Operation Ballarat was about to turn into a desperate fight for survival, one that would test 7RAR's courage, tactics, and endurance like never before. August 6, 1967. A company, 7RAR, moved out early under overcast skies. The monsoon humidity clung to everything: weapons, boots, even skin. The men were already soaked with sweat before they'd gone a kilometer. Their mission was routine by Vietnam standards: patrol the Suoi Chau Pa area as part of Operation Ballarat, searching for enemy bunkers and signs of Viet Cong movement. But there was nothing routine about the terrain. The jungle was thick, tangled, and almost deliberately disorienting. Visibility was reduced to a few meters in any direction. Communication between sections had to be tight. Every sound, a snapped twig, a bird suddenly going silent, made nerves tighten. Leading the patrol was 2 platoon, followed by 3 and 1 platoon in depth, spread out for flexibility. Their movement was careful, deliberate. The soldiers scanned every shadow, every suspicious shape. They had no illusions. This was dangerous country, and D445 Battalion had operated here before. Then came the first signs. A broken branch, a disturbed patch of ground, an oddly quiet pocket of jungle that felt wrong. The scouts picked it up first, small details that pointed to something recent, something nearby. Still they pushed forward. As they approached a slight rise near the Suoi Chau Pa stream, the undergrowth thickened. The men slowed their pace. The ground felt too open, the terrain too perfect for concealment. They were now deep in unfamiliar territory, beyond quick support range, relying solely on each other, radios, and the hope that artillery could reach them if needed. And then, it happened. The lead element walked straight into a hornet's nest. Automatic fire exploded from the flanks. RPGs shrieked overhead. Grenades rained down from hidden positions. In seconds, the patrol was pinned, fragmented, and bleeding. The Viet Cong hadn't just laid an ambush. They had built a battlefield. The jungle detonated. What began as a few bursts of gunfire erupted into a full-scale ambush. From tree lines and bunkers the Australians hadn't seen, the Viet Cong's D445 Battalion opened up with a torrent of AK-47 fire, RPGs, machine guns, and grenades. The lead platoon was hammered immediately. Soldiers dropped to the ground, returning fire wherever they could. Some barely had time to hit the dirt before bullets whipped over their heads. The noise was deafening, a brutal combination of gunfire, shouting, explosions, and radios crackling as calls for support screamed through. Major O'Donnell, a company's commander, moved quickly. Orders were barked over the radio. His men were trained, battle-hardened, and now completely pinned. The VC weren't retreating like they often did. This was different. This was coordinated. They were well dug in and firing from prepared fighting pits. Multiple positions opened up at once, attacking from multiple directions. It was a textbook L-shaped ambush, and the Australians had walked straight into it. Amid the chaos, medics crawled under fire to reach the wounded. Some soldiers fired blind through the jungle just to keep heads down. One group returned grenades as fast as they landed. Machine gunners, finding what cover they could, laid down suppressive fire so wounded men could crawl back behind tree roots and bomb craters. The vegetation became a death trap. Smoke mixed with the humidity and blocked vision. Radios crackled with broken transmissions as platoons tried to regroup under fire. Close artillery support was requested. Danger close. RAA, Royal Australian Artillery, batteries from Nui Dot and FSB Horseshoe responded immediately, firing coordinated salvos. Shells tore through the jungle canopy, smashing enemy bunkers and scattering VC fighters. But it was still not enough to break the assault. The enemy was committed. They surged again. VC fighters launched another push toward the Australians' flanks. This time, 3 platoon met them with blistering fire and grenades. The Australians were holding, but just barely. Ammunition was running low. Casualties were mounting. The heat was oppressive, and there was no real cover. Only mud, trees, and determination. At one point, enemy fighters tried to infiltrate the rear of A Company's position, circling through the trees. But they were spotted and cut down by a pair of Australians manning a light machine gun with near-perfect timing. In the middle of it all, the Australians showed discipline under pressure. Fire was controlled. Orders were followed. Wounded men refused to be evacuated until others were safe. One soldier reportedly held off an enemy element single-handedly with a rifle, a bayonet, and sheer refusal to give ground. As hours dragged on, the Australian position remained intact, battered but unbroken. The enemy had thrown waves of force at them and failed to collapse their defense. The jungle had become a cauldron, but the line held. Eventually, under the weight of artillery, aggressive counterfire, and mounting casualties, the VC began to withdraw. Like ghosts, they melted back into the trees, fast, silent, and dragging their dead and wounded with them. They'd ambushed the Australians with overwhelming force. and still they hadn't broken them. As the smoke drifted through the trees and the air filled with the metallic sting of gunpowder, the Australians dug in. The enemy wasn't finished. After the initial ambush, the Viet Cong regrouped and tried again, striking hard at the flanks, searching for a break in the Australian perimeter. But the men of 7 RAR were ready now. They knew the terrain, they knew their arcs of fire, and they'd already bled too much to give up an inch. Radio traffic between forward elements and Company HQ painted a grim picture. Casualty reports were mounting. Ammunition was running low in some platoons. Multiple soldiers were critically wounded, and medevacs were being requested urgently. But the jungle was too hot. Choppers couldn't safely land until the area was secured. Still, the Australians held. Major O'Donnell coordinated defensive sectors and ordered additional artillery missions. Again, danger close. Rounds from 105mm howitzers came crashing down just meters from their position, walking a wall of fire through enemy approach lines. It was risky, but it worked. It bought precious time. Section leaders repositioned their men to cover new angles. Fire teams rotated barrels on machine guns to keep them from jamming. Some wounded soldiers refused to fall back, instead propping themselves against trees. Others volunteered to carry extra ammunition forward, even under heavy contact. And through it all, there was no panic, just sharp, brutal professionalism. Then came the turning point. The Viet Cong launched one final push, a concerted effort to break the Australian lines. But they ran straight into 3 platoon, reinforced and dug in. The Australians unleashed everything: rifles, machine guns, M79 grenade launchers, and it tore through the advancing force. When that assault broke, so did the enemy's momentum. By now, artillery fire was relentless, smashing suspected VC fallback positions. Helicopter gunships arrived overhead, firing rockets into escape routes. What had started as an ambush was now turning into an Australian counteroffensive. As enemy fire tapered off, medevac choppers finally got the green light. Pilots flew in low, under threat, to extract the wounded. Smoke grenades marked landing zones carved into jungle clearings. Medics loaded stretchers fast, knowing the enemy could return at any moment. By late afternoon, it was clear the Australians had not just survived. They'd won. They had faced a numerically superior, well-prepared force and held the line under some of the worst combat conditions of the entire war. It wasn't clean, it wasn't perfect, but it was enough. And for the men of A Company, that was all that mattered. By late afternoon, the jungle finally fell silent. What had been a kill zone just hours earlier was now a battlefield strewn with the wreckage of close combat, twisted foliage, expended magazines, empty shell casings, and the harsh reality of casualties. The Viet Cong had broken contact, retreating into the dense jungle with their wounded and dead, using hidden trails and spider holes to vanish almost as quickly as they had appeared. The Australians, bloodied and exhausted, began to assess what was left. 5 Australians had been killed. More than 20 were wounded, several critically. Among them were soldiers he hit in the first moments of the ambush, medics injured while trying to save others, and men who had fought on despite taking shrapnel and gunfire. Some wounded had walked out on their own. Others had to be stretchered through jungle and mud under constant threat of renewed contact. The battlefield was slowly secured. A perimeter was reestablished. Patrols swept the area to confirm the enemy had truly withdrawn. What they found was staggering. Numerous enemy dead, some still in their bunkers, others scattered along the approach routes. Blood trails marked the paths of those who had been dragged away. In the confusion, intelligence teams gathered what they could: documents, weapons, maps, anything left behind in the VC's hasty retreat. It became clear that the Australians had engaged a large element of D445 Battalion, likely reinforced for a planned future attack. Instead, they'd been caught early and decisively disrupted. The Royal Australian Artillery's precision had played a major role. So had the calm leadership under fire and the discipline of infantrymen who had trained for exactly this kind of scenario. But it had come at a cost. As helicopters lifted out the last of the wounded, those who remained began to dig in for the night. Even in victory, no one let their guard down. In Vietnam, silence didn't mean safety. Not yet. The Battle of Suoi Chau Pa had ended, but for those on the ground, its echoes would linger long after the last gunshot faded. The next morning, as the sun broke over the jungle canopy, a company faced the grim task of moving forward. The Battle of Suoi Chau Pa had lasted only hours, but it left a deep scar. The ground was churned by explosions and stained with blood. Craters marked the jungle floor. Trees had been shredded by gunfire and artillery. The quiet was unsettling. Too quiet. Back at Nui Dat, the full weight of what had happened began to register. News of the engagement spread quickly through the ranks. 5 men had been killed, a devastating toll for a single contact. Many more were wounded, some severely. For 7 RAR, it was one of the costliest days of the war so far. But it was also one of the clearest examples of courage under fire. Questions naturally followed. Had the intelligence underestimated the enemy presence? Should the company have had closer support or heavier weapons? Was the patrol area too deep, too isolated? But there was also pride. Reports from the battlefield highlighted acts of incredible bravery. Soldiers who carried wounded mates through fire, machine gunners who held positions alone under attack, medics who worked while bleeding. Artillery crews had responded instantly and with terrifying accuracy. The company had held its ground and refused to be overrun, despite being ambushed by a numerically superior, dug-in enemy. In the days that followed, Operation Ballarat continued, but the focus shifted. Every patrol from that point forward operated with sharpened caution, scanning every rise and gully for signs of another ambush. The battle at Suoi Chau Pa had changed the way 7 RAR moved, fought, and thought about the war. At base, memorial services were held. Letters were written home. Equipment was cleaned in silence. The soldiers processed the battle in their own way, but none forgot what had happened that day in the jungle. It wasn't just another fight. It was a defining moment. The Battle of Suoi Chau Pa quickly became one of the most studied engagements in Australia's Vietnam War experience. It wasn't just the intensity of the fight, it was what the battle revealed. That in Vietnam, even the best-trained soldiers could find themselves in a life-or-death situation with zero warning. That the enemy was capable, cunning, and always watching. And that success would rely not just on firepower, but on leadership, coordination, and raw personal courage. For 7 RAR, the battle left a permanent mark. It showed the importance of inter-unit communication, forward artillery planning, and having rapid casualty evacuation procedures, all of which had been pushed to their limits that day. It also reinforced something every soldier already knew, but rarely said out loud, that the jungle was never really under control. You could sweep an area, patrol it, burn it, clear it, and the next day the enemy would be back. Suoi Chau Pa became a teaching point for Australian forces in country. Training was adjusted. Patrol formations were refined. Emphasis was placed on reacting under ambush conditions, not just initiating contact. The battle also confirmed what the Viet Cong already knew. Australian soldiers were not easy targets. For the men who fought there, the legacy was personal. The faces of those who didn't come home stayed with them. Some never spoke of the battle again. Others told their stories in pieces, in barracks, over beers, or years later at reunions. To historians, it remains a perfect example of what Vietnam really was. Brutal, fast, and unforgiving. A place where minutes felt like hours, and where every decision could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Suoi Chau Pa wasn't famous. It wasn't shown on the news. But for those who were there, it was unforgettable. The Battle of Suoi Chau Pa wasn't a headline war story. It wasn't fought in a city or broadcast on TV. There were no medals paraded in front of cameras, no front-page heroics. Just Australian soldiers, tired, outnumbered, deep in the jungle, who refused to give in. What they faced that day was brutal. What they did was extraordinary. They held the line. These are the kinds of stories history often overlooks, not because they lack importance, but because they were carried out quietly, with grit, discipline, and sacrifice. Suoi Chau Pa showed the worst of war and the best of those who fought it. If you value these kinds of untold chapters, the ones that don't make documentaries or textbooks, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Over 90% of our viewers aren't subscribed, and your support helps us bring stories like this back into the light. And to the veterans of the 7th Royal Australian Regiment and the families of those who never returned, we honor your service, your strength, and your sacrifice. Thanks for watching. The sun was blinding, the air was thick with humidity, and somewhere, just beyond the wall of jungle, the enemy was waiting. On February 17, 1967, Australian soldiers were dropped into the coastal flatlands of Phuoc Tuy province for what was supposed to be a swift, punishing strike against a retreating Viet Cong force. Intelligence suggested the enemy was on the run. The mission was simple: cut them off, corner them, and wipe them out. But the Viet Cong weren't running. They were dug in. What followed was one of the most brutal single-day battles Australian troops would fight during the entire Vietnam War. A chaotic, close-quarters engagement that left armored vehicles burning in the sand, soldiers pinned down in chest-deep swamp water, and medics dragging the wounded out under fire. Operation Bribie was a lesson written in blood. The Australian forces were well-trained, well-armed, and backed by air and artillery support. But none of it mattered when the jungle swallowed them whole, and the enemy sprang their trap with ruthless precision. 8 Australians were killed, more than 20 were wounded, and questions about what went wrong would haunt commanders for years to come. This is the story of Operation Bribie, the battle that shattered illusions, changed tactics, and reminded everyone that in Vietnam, no operation ever goes as planned. By early 1967, the Vietnam War was escalating fast. Australia had committed thousands of troops to the conflict, joining its American ally in the fight against communist expansion. The 1st Australian Task Force, 1ATF, was based in Phuoc Tuy province, southeast of Saigon, a hotbed of Viet Cong activity. Australian commanders were focused on counterinsurgency, long patrols, intelligence gathering, and hitting guerrilla units before they disappeared into the jungle. But just after the Tet Lunar New Year truce, reports came in. A large Viet Cong force had been spotted regrouping near the village of Ap Mayan, not far from the coast. It appeared to be the enemy's 274th Regiment, part of the same force responsible for ambushes and attacks against ARVN and Allied troops in the region. Command saw an opportunity: catch the Viet Cong before they slipped away. The plan was to launch a rapid, overwhelming strike. Infantry would be flown in by helicopter, while armored vehicles moved in by road. Artillery and air support would be on standby. The objective was clear: trap and destroy. There was confidence in the air. After months of patrolling and minor clashes, this was the kind of bold action that promised results. But Vietnam didn't reward boldness, it punished assumptions. And at Briby, the cost would be high. If you're enjoying this breakdown of Australia's forgotten battles in Vietnam, take a second to hit like and subscribe. Over 90% of our viewers aren't subscribed yet, and it helps more people discover stories like this. The ones history forgot, but soldiers never did. Back in Phuoc Tuy, helicopters began spinning up. Troops loaded in, unaware that the operation they were about to launch would leave vehicles burning, wounded dragged through swamps, and a brutal ambush carved into the memory of every man who survived. The helicopters came in low over the treetops, kicking up dirt, smoke, and swirls of dead grass as they dropped into the landing zone. Just after noon on February 17, 1967, B Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 6th RAR, was inserted into the sandy coastal plains near Ap Mayan, a small hamlet along the Long Hai Peninsula, just north of the Courtenay rubber plantation. The terrain looked open and manageable: sand dunes, patches of low scrub, and cane fields stretching toward thicker jungle. It seemed ideal for maneuvering troops and vehicles. But appearances in Vietnam were always deceiving. The soldiers quickly fanned out, weapons up, eyes scanning the tree line. Their mission was to engage and destroy a reported Viet Cong force believed to be retreating inland from the coast. What they didn't know was that the enemy wasn't running at all. They were waiting, hidden in cleverly prepared bunkers that blended perfectly into the dense foliage. At first, there was only silence. Then a few signs: trampled brush, fresh footprints, the lingering smell of cigarette smoke in the air. The kind of details soldiers learn to notice when death is nearby. Then the radio crackled. Enemy contact. Within moments, automatic fire erupted from the tree line ahead. Bravo Company had walked into the kill zone. Viet Cong machine guns opened up in synchronized bursts, pinning the lead elements to the ground. A K-47 fire cracked through the air. RPGs slammed into nearby trees and sand. Several Australians were hit within the first minutes. The terrain offered little protection. What looked open from the air was actually a maze of shallow swamps, tangled scrub, and hard, dry sand that made it nearly impossible to dig in. Every movement exposed the soldiers further. As Bravo Company returned fire and tried to reposition, it became clear. The enemy was not only prepared, they were dug in with deliberate kill zones. And more concerning still, they weren't pulling back. They were holding their ground, with enough strength to challenge an entire Australian company head-on. The mission had shifted. This was no longer a quick search and destroy operation. This was a battle, and the Australians were now fighting for every inch of ground. Bravo Company was pinned. Fire came from the front, both flanks, and even from behind. The Viet Cong had laid out their ambush with ruthless precision, using interlocking arcs of fire from concealed bunkers and spider holes. Every movement drew fresh bursts of gunfire. What had started as a quick search mission had become a desperate fight to survive. The Australians responded fast. Platoon commanders shouted orders over the roar of gunfire, trying to establish a firing line and return accurate fire. Soldiers crawled through the sand, seeking whatever cover they could find, behind logs in shallow depressions, next to burning vegetation. Every inch of movement was met with incoming fire. The enemy wasn't just reacting, they were prepared for this exact fight. Radio operators called in for artillery support. Within minutes, 105mm howitzers from Nui Dat began raining down shells onto enemy positions. Danger close. The jungle shook as explosions ripped through the trees, but the enemy was dug in deep. Bunkers made of timber and earth absorbed the blasts, and when the shelling paused, the gunfire resumed just as fierce. By early afternoon, Alpha Company was ordered in to reinforce Bravo and flank the enemy positions. They were met with the same resistance: well-sighted machine guns, snipers in trees, and carefully placed RPG teams. Several armored personnel carriers, APCs from C Squadron, 3rd Cavalry Regiment joined the fight, rolling into the thick of the battle with their M113s, guns blazing. But even armor wasn't safe. One APC was hit by RPG fire and burst into flames, killing several of its crew. The terrain was working against them. Sandy soil gave no traction. Underbrush masked enemy positions. And worst of all, parts of the area were flooded, knee-deep swamp water that made it almost impossible to maneuver or evacuate the wounded. As the hours dragged on, casualties mounted. Medics worked under fire, dragging injured soldiers back through muddy fields, treating gunshot wounds and burns behind thin trees and APCs. Several acts of bravery went unrecorded, soldiers exposing themselves to pull wounded mates out of the line of fire. The Viet Cong showed no sign of retreat. They fought hard, determined to make the Australians bleed for every foot of ground. At one point, a platoon commander attempted a direct assault on an enemy bunker line, but was forced to fall back after suffering more losses. Meanwhile, air support was finally cleared. Royal Australian Air Force and U.S. aircraft roared overhead, dropping bombs and firing rockets into suspected enemy positions. The jungle exploded with napalm and high explosives. Still, the fighting didn't let up. The Viet Cong were deeply embedded, and many slipped away during the chaos, only to return minutes later to attack from new angles. By late afternoon, the Australians had pushed the enemy back from the central engagement area, but they hadn't broken them. Ammunition was running low. Wounded were still scattered across the battlefield. The smell of smoke, sweat, and cordite filled the air. Bodies of both Australian and Viet Cong lay still in the mud and brush. Command faced a difficult choice: continue pressing forward into unknown terrain, possibly into another ambush, or withdraw and consolidate. They chose to pull back. Operation Briby had become a brutal reminder that in Vietnam, even with superior training, artillery, and air support, the enemy always had the home advantage, and they knew exactly how to use it. As dusk approached on February 17th, the battlefield was smoldering. Littered with wrecked vegetation, scattered gear, and the bodies of both Australian and Viet Cong soldiers. The objective to trap and destroy the enemy had failed. The Viet Cong had dug in, drawn the Australians into a brutal engagement, inflicted casualties, and then vanished into the jungle the moment momentum shifted. With darkness setting in and the risk of further ambushes rising, the order was given: withdraw and consolidate. But pulling out wasn't simple. Many of the wounded were still pinned down or stranded in exposed positions. Smoke still hung over the fields. Muddy ground and knee-deep swamps made stretcher movement agonizingly slow. Medics and infantry alike braved enemy fire to reach their mates, refusing to leave anyone behind. Some carried wounded men on their backs. Others crawled through muck, bullets snapping overhead, to reach downed comrades. The enemy harassed the withdrawal every step of the way. Sporadic sniper fire rang out from the tree line. Tracers occasionally cut through the twilight. The Australians laid down covering fire while artillery hammered likely escape routes, creating walls of shrapnel between the withdrawing troops and the jungle beyond. Aircraft buzzed low overhead, dropping flares to light up the terrain and deter follow-up attacks. Dust-off helicopters hovered in to extract the most seriously wounded, their rotors whipping smoke and debris into the air. Some armored vehicles had to be abandoned. One M113, hit earlier by RPG fire, sat smoldering as a grim reminder of how exposed even armor could be in Vietnam's unforgiving terrain. By nightfall, the Australian forces had pulled back, battered but intact. The dead had been recovered. The wounded were in the care of field medics. But morale was shaken. This hadn't gone to plan. The enemy hadn't broken. They'd stood and fought, then melted away on their own terms. The mission had been to destroy a retreating force. Instead, the Australians had walked into a well-laid ambush and been forced to fight their way back out. It was a hard lesson. In Vietnam, initiative could vanish in an instant, and survival often depended less on plans and more on grit. By the morning of February 18th, the scale of the previous day's battle had become painfully clear. 8 Australian soldiers were killed during Operation Bribie, one of the heaviest single-day losses for the Australian Army at that point in the Vietnam War. More than 24 others were wounded, many seriously. Among them were men burned inside armored vehicles, shot during attempted flanking maneuvers, or hit while carrying the wounded to safety. The enemy had taken losses too. Dozens of Viet Cong were confirmed dead, with trails of blood and drag marks suggesting many more had been carried away. But there was no sense of triumph among the Australians. The enemy had not been destroyed. They had chosen the time, place, and terms of the engagement. And when it was over, they slipped back into the jungle, as they had so many times before. Commanders began asking hard questions. Why hadn't intelligence picked up the enemy's prepared bunkers? Why was the terrain so poorly understood? Why were soldiers sent into swampy, uneven ground where vehicles bogged down and movement became nearly impossible? Officially, the operation was declared a tactical success. Enemy forces had been engaged and suffered casualties. But among the troops, there was little feeling of victory. Many considered it a near disaster, a mission that had nearly gone entirely wrong, saved only by the grit and determination of soldiers on the ground and the overwhelming firepower of artillery and air support. In Australia, media coverage was cautious. The casualty count could not be ignored, but the narrative was controlled. Reports emphasized the bravery of the troops and the success of the operation, but the grim details rarely reached the public in full. For those who fought at Briby, the aftermath was personal. They remembered the heat, the smoke, the sudden burst of gunfire, the cries for medics, and the weight of carrying wounded friends through the mud. It was a reminder that no mission in Vietnam was ever simple, and that underestimating the enemy, even for a moment, could turn a clean plan into a bloody, chaotic fight for survival. Operation Bribie left more than physical scars. It shook the confidence of commanders, exposed cracks in planning and intelligence, and forced a rethink of how Australian forces operated in Vietnam. Tactically, Briby became a case study in what not to do. The decision to insert troops near Ap Mian was based on outdated assumptions, that the enemy was on the move, not entrenched. There had been no thorough reconnaissance of the area, no confirmed intelligence on defensive positions, and no clear understanding of the terrain, which turned out to be a nightmare. Dry sand that bogged vehicles, cane fields that concealed bunkers, and swampy patches that trapped men during the fight. The Viet Cong had turned that terrain into a weapon. They had learned how to fight the Australians, drawing them in, pinning them down, and bleeding them before disappearing. After Bribie, Australian doctrine began to shift. No longer would units launch large-scale sweeps into unfamiliar areas without better intelligence. Greater emphasis was placed on deliberate reconnaissance, patrolling, and small unit operations. Tactics that had served the Australians well in earlier campaigns like Malaya. Commanders also saw the limits of armored support. The M113 APCs were valuable in open ground, but in swamp and cane fields they were vulnerable and easily immobilized. New coordination procedures were introduced for infantry and armor to avoid repeat losses like those at Briby. Politically, the operation came at a sensitive time. Public support for the war was already weakening in Australia. News of the casualties, especially the deaths of 8 soldiers in a single day, hit hard back home. While official statements emphasized enemy losses and successes, families and veterans knew the truth. This had been a fight for survival, not a clean victory. Questions were raised in Parliament. Some politicians began to press harder on the broader cost of the war, not just in dollars but in blood. Briby became a quiet turning point. It didn't make headlines like Long Ton, but inside the Australian military, it changed how commanders viewed the battlefield. And inside the homes of those who lost sons, brothers, and fathers, it reinforced a bitter reality. Vietnam wasn't a quick campaign. It was a grinding war with no safe plans, only hard lessons. Operation Bribie never became a household name. It didn't inspire books, documentaries, or political speeches. It was buried beneath louder battles and more dramatic headlines. But for the soldiers who were there, it never faded. For many veterans, Briby represented the harshest kind of lesson, that courage and discipline weren't always enough, that even the best trained forces could be caught off guard, especially in a war where the enemy wrote the rules, and the jungle obeyed no command. The men who fought that day showed exceptional bravery under fire. Medics who ran through open ground to reach the wounded. Troops who held their positions in the face of withering fire. Commanders who made life-or-death decisions while surrounded and outgunned. Their efforts prevented a disaster from becoming something far worse. Over time, Operation Bribie came to be studied not just for what went wrong, but for what was learned. The experience directly shaped how the Australian Army adapted its tactics for the remainder of the Vietnam War. Patrol doctrine evolved. Coordination between infantry, armor, and air support improved. Quick, reaction-based operations gave way to deeper planning and preparation. Today, the battle is remembered within the ranks of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, as a defining moment in their Vietnam experience. Annual remembrances, regimental histories, and veteran gatherings keep the memory alive. Not in celebration, but in solemn recognition. Briby didn't end with medals or victory parades. It ended in exhaustion, silence, and the long journey back to base. But in its aftermath, it left something more lasting than headlines. A hardened understanding of what the Vietnam War truly was. It was unforgiving, unpredictable, and deeply personal. Operation Bribie wasn't a triumph, but it was a turning point. It exposed the dangers of underestimating the enemy, of acting on flawed intelligence, and of believing that superior firepower alone could win the day. But it also revealed something deeper, the raw grit of Australian soldiers. Men who fought through chaos, carried their wounded under fire, and refused to leave anyone behind. In a war full of forgotten moments, Briby stands as a quiet monument to resilience and to the steep cost of every inch gained in Vietnam. If you found this story powerful, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Over 90% of our viewers aren't subscribed yet, and it helps us keep telling the stories that history books too often skip over. Let us know in the comments, had you ever heard of Operation Bribie before? And which Vietnam War battle should we cover next? Bin Ba, Coral Balmoral, or the Tet Offensive from the Anzac perspective? Thanks for watching, and to the veterans of Bribie, we remember your sacrifice. Australia sent over 60,000 men to Vietnam. 521 of them never came home. They served alongside Americans, fought the same enemy, bled on the same ground, and came home to the same silence. No parades, no recognition, just men trying to forget what they'd seen. But their stories are real. Their sacrifice was real, and they deserved better. If this documentary meant something to you, hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with someone who needs to hear what Australia did in Vietnam. Every like, every subscriber, every share, that's how these forgotten soldiers reach one more person. They gave everything. The least we can do is remember them. Subscribe, like, share. Until next time.